So we'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Schneider is a leading spokesperson for humanistic, and existential-integrative psychology, an adjunct faculty member at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia University, and a co-founder and current president of the award-winning Existential-Humanistic Institute. He was a 2022 candidate for president-elect of the American Psychological Association, and Dr. Schneider is fellow of 7 divisions of the APA and the recipient of the Rollo May Award from Division 32 for his outstanding independent pursuit of new frontiers in humanistic psychology. He is also the author of 15 books. Today, he will be talking about his latest book, which is entitled Life Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World. Dr. Schneider's current focus, which draws on the psychology of Otto Rank, is on the existential basis of, as well as alternatives to, polarized states of being. In the announcement that I sent out, the link in his bio has his YouTube channel and also his website, which has more information. So I'll just refer that to you. It's in my announcement. And also I attached a book review regarding this current book. That was yesterday when I sent it out. So if you want to have access to that. And with no further ado, Dr. Schneider, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Albert and Elizabeth, for your wonderful hospitality. And it really is an honor to be here this morning. As some of you may know, I'm a former student and great friend of a former training and supervisory analyst here, Rollo May. And so I hope to bring a little of the spirit of Rollo here in my own suit of clothes, so to speak. And speaking of that, believe it or not, I'm actually wearing Rollo's jacket. So I'm very honored. A few weeks ago, I met with another old mentor of mine, Stanley Krippner, and he knew Rollo very well. And at Rollo's passing, he received Rollo's coat from Georgia, Rollo's wife, at the time. And I saw it once at an APA presentation, and I said, man, what a coat you have. And he says, it's Rollo's coat, and I will give it to you someday. And sure enough, a couple of weeks ago, he's going into assisted living. He so generously gave me Rollo's coat. So I'm communing with it and with you all. Rollo, for those of you who don't know that much about Rollo, he was a very important part of the Institute in the 1940s, I think maybe early 50s. He was an Alisand of Eric Fromm, and I know they had quite an intense relationship, but one of the things that Rollo used to say about Eric Fromm was that he very trenchantly observed that the taxi cab drivers in New York City were the best psychoanalysts. So that's one little anecdote. And that he also wrote the book Escape from Freedom to escape from his wife Frida Reichman, who wrote a beautiful book in her own right. And she's perhaps closer to an existential humanistic tenor than Eric Fromm, at least in terms of psychotherapy itself. So I hope we will have a chance to touch on kind of different angle for you all in the existential humanistic perspective. But before we do that, I would like to begin with a case vignette, quite brief. In this talk on life-enhancing anxiety. Both parents appeared for the first interview. They identified the patient's problem as being a thumbsucker with shreds of an old blanket which he soaks in urine even after mother washed it. The patient is enuretic every night. This is an apparently withdrawn child ever since the death of his his brother from myocarditis, disease attacking the heart, when the patient was almost 3 years of age. The brother had been sick for almost 10 months and died in Boston, where he had been taken for consultation after an initial workup at Babies and Children's Hospital. The patient had been left during this time. The mother left entirely during this period in a psychological sense. She had the patient cared for during the brother's illness by her own mother, who, according to the patient's father, was quite hysterical. The mother, according to her and her husband, was in a depression for about 4 years after the death of the brother. The brother had been a brilliant child. He talked well and was considered to be a star. He was the light of his mother's eye. Mother was and is a TV commercial spokesperson. The patient had a good relationship with his brother prior to his death and with his mother, but it was entirely secondary to his brother. The father generally assumed the mother's role with the patient. The father would take the patient, who was quite regressed at this time, to movies, Snow White, for example, plus other scary movies. The mother, following the brother's death and illness, because of her rejection of the patient, was then rejected by the patient. According to my notes, the boy was very angry with his mother. This began to change somewhat when she had been in psychotherapy. This is because she was able to work more effectively with him, could talk with him, and be more of a mother. She could communicate with him, which she could not do previously because of the brother's death. It is not clear why the parents have brought the patient at this point, when he has obviously been quite disturbed for years. There's obviously much disagreement between the parents. The mother took off for a week by herself after the brother's death, which likely made things more difficult. And several times a similar trip has been taken since. I thought, as I understood my notes, that the mother's depression, without doubt, has played a major part in the way she expresses her anger at her husband and at the patient's refusal to let her cuddle or kiss him. The patient regressed quite a bit after the brother's death and cried for days. Gradually, he came out of it with his father's help. I felt the patient was a very bright child who was terribly frightened and excited by witches and things between legs, mother, father, primal scene probably. He could hardly stop talking about many of these things. He related extremely well. He was talking about many things he had observed, a confusion about death and dying, witches, primal scene, etc. As I recall, my recommendation was that the patient needed psychotherapy or perhaps even analysis to try to work through the traumatic events in his life, in addition to the ordinary overstimulated and exciting things going on around him. As I recall, I'm not entirely sure, I think I came down on the side of psychoanalysis rather than psychotherapy, because I thought the patient likely had rather major unconscious internalized conflicts. So, as some of you may surmise, that patient was me. At 6 years old in 1962. And the analyst was a local analyst in Cleveland who had worked some with Anna Freud, and obviously was a child analyst. He was referred by my mother, actually, who was in psychoanalysis after my brother died. This was very unusual, and I grant that my upbringing, my beginning, was very unusual for kind of a working class, middle class neighborhood in the outskirts of Cleveland. But my mother and father were very insightful psychologically. My mother didn't have any formal training in therapy, but she clearly was very tuned in and also understandably extremely distressed after the death of my brother. My father was a humanistic educator, taught math and science, and eventually became a professor of education. But I grew up with Rollo May and Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, Ernest Schachtel, Eric Fromm, etc., surrounding me as a kid. I'd use their books for building blocks, actually. So again, an unusual upbringing, but maybe gives us some hints about the developmental path. I want to emphasize how important that psychoanalysis I did eventually have with, I can say his name, I think Dr. Edwin Schiff, who's now deceased. And by the way, I got these notes. What an amazing thing to get a window into your life from a psychoanalyst when you're 6 years old. I got them when I was about 35, and I was doing a book on classic horror books and films called Horror and the Holy. And I thought it would be really important to find out more in depth about my early exposure to the horrific. And he was so generous, took out a little ragged notebook and next day wrote it up, sent me his notes. This was just a sample of them. They're in the book, the fuller notes. But that therapy and then an existential analysis later on when I was in graduate school were extremely formative for me. I can't overemphasize what life-changing experience and perhaps life-salvaging, life in the symbolic sense of really being able to live one's life, that these therapies were for me. I don't remember a thing that Dr. Schiff said to me, but what I do remember is his rock-solid presence. And he struck me as an extremely seasoned guy. He was middle-aged at the time I saw him as a kid, but had a little sense of humor and related well. He related well to me also. And he was like a steadying force, steadying lever in a torrential storm of fears, night terrors. As you heard, I was terribly afraid of witches, monsters. They would appear at my window. I was in very bad shape for several years, to the point where some concern about my losing touch with reality. But I want to say about those things, and also some obviously, and I think understandably, fear of my mother, which came into this clinical picture and may have equated with the witch symbolism. I want to say that although I think Dr. Schiff was very accurate in his observations of these fear fantasies, I don't think they go to the deeper layers that they symbolize. These are fears. And we know that fears are ways of focusing and managing parts of deeper anxieties. At least that's my clinical understanding. So witches, monsters become symbols of something even deeper. And that's something I want to convey to you all because it's something in existential analysis and depth psychotherapy we emphasize, which is not only our relationship to our parental system and the culture, but our relationship to existence. And our feeling is that that's an extremely critical aspect of the developmental path, especially when one's traumatized. I'll be getting into it more, but I think that the deeper, more primal terror that these symbols represented was a terror of the unknown. the uncontainable and the uncontrolled. And if you think about those symbols and the people involved in the constellation, and even the primal scene, I think you can see how those imply even deeper fears of this very precarious existence that we're living in. And this sense of not just the unknown, but the radically unknown. And certainly when you come into the world and when you're very young and without equipment to work with that, it becomes quite harrowing. So that's a lot of what my depth psychotherapies brought, was gradual immersion in this harrowing unknown and the uncontained that I was swirling about in. And he did that, again, in large part at a feeling level through his containment and his ability to be with me, and also my sense that he had been there in some way himself, that he was seasoned, he had been through a lot himself, and yet he was this very accomplished person before me. So a model in many ways. And what Dr. Schiff helped me to do through evoking my ability to gradually stay with these terrors and see them in a more realistic light, like that I had nothing to do with the death of my brother, and my parents had nothing to do with the death of my brother, and that these things tragically happen, and beginning to raise questions. Even at that young age, I was able to begin to question and move from a place of basically abject terror and paralysis to incremental curiosity and even wonder about this new situation I was in. Coming from a place where the fabric of the routine and familiar was almost totally ripped apart after his passing. Nothing was the same in the family system and at the micro level as well, just in terms of greeting each other and seeing each other's expressions. Complete upending as that fabric was torn and I was thrust into a free fall, a vast unknown. So through this immersive process with Dr. Schiff, I began to become more and more interested in what death and dying and the bigger questions of life brought up. We usually don't experience those until middle age. Well, I feel like I had my middle age crisis. It's 3 and 6 years old. So I became increasingly interested in and even fascinated with human behavior experience, the question of the meaning of life, again, in a rudimentary way, but just very curious, more and more curious, able to be with those places that were unmoored and uncontained and seeing more possibilities. And that led eventually to an interest in coming up with my own plays. And my father was great, also great with kids. And we had an old woolen sack tape recorder, reel to reel. And so he would, play with me, interact with me, setting up skits, or just let me, kind of free associate. And I talked about all kinds of things, the government, pollution, and, strange as a 6-year-old. But I remember we did skits together, played different parts of some scary movies. That's another question, of course, of how much he exposed me to. He was more bold in that sense than my mother. She was much more reticent and concerned with me being overstimulated. And that's what Schiff was speaking to earlier. But I also became increasingly interested in kind of my own stable of actors, men and women that I set up plays with. These were toy figures. And as I became older, I had a great interest in science fiction, increasing interest in classic horror, especially like Edgar Allan Poe. And you can imagine, I'm sure I was working through some things in my engagement with these strange creatures, strange thoughts, ventures to other planets. But it was very stimulating to me. And this is a case where I think television was pretty good, at least in those days, with shows like The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone. I mean, these were very evocative, engaging programs about how that which is other and different could maybe be intriguing and actually informative. So I'll just give one quick anecdote about that. I remember the first episode of Outer Limits was with Cliff Robertson, who played a radio engineer, a radio operator in a small town in a tower. And so he would work the electronics, the tech stuff. Until one evening, he saw something strange in the electrical signals in the station. They were firing off and causing all kinds of havoc and static. And before you know it, something emerged from that equipment. And it was a huge electrified monster. And it broke out of the studio and began a rampage, or what you might call a rampage, a very steady, strong walk toward the center of town. Imagine the 60-foot electrified monster coming to the center of town. Well, as in typical B-movie fashion, although this was much higher than that, they called out the National Guard, the police. They were ready in the center of town with their guns poised, townspeople with their pitchforks. And as the thing approached, it stopped. It towered over them and said, "Put down your guns, go home, and contemplate the mysteries of the universe." Now, how many times have any of you, seen B-movies that have such philosophical monsters in them? But that stayed with me a long time. And it really, in a nutshell, represents my life, my life trajectory of at first being terrified by that which is radically unknown, radically other and different. But then gradually, in finding my ground or some degree of centeredness in that maelstrom, beginning to see, a monster is something different than what I expected. So now I'm going to go to share some slides that I think may be useful for you. And you can see those quotes. I think they're reflective of the narrative that I just gave you about my own life. Rollo was always very keen on seeing freedom as the flip side of anxiety, and felt that we really had a lack of the right anxiety, or dealing with the right anxiety in our culture and in our upbringing, because we close it off so quickly. And that the, quote, right anxiety helps us to live on the edge of wonder and discovery, not just terror and overwhelm. This is my book. So, yeah, one of the main points of my book and the main points that I want to make here is that we have so much anxiety, so much destructive anxiety in our culture and often our family systems, precisely because we're not supported to face the deeper, more primal anxieties that could help us stave off or limit those more destructive anxieties that drive us blindly to self-devaluation, devaluation of others, to the narrowing of perception that I call the polarized mind, or the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And you may be able to see that this is a syndrome that's reflective of both the individual, what we call psychopathology, when we become overly identified with the fear-based aspects of our lives and thus become depressed, anxious, extremely constricted, or we could go the other way and become hyper attached to arousal, stimulation, explosiveness, impulsivity. The point is to do everything we can to avoid any hint of that primal terror of the unknown and of that which is different and other. So, yeah, I think we really need to deal with this primal terror of the unknown as early as possible. And I know you all are very immersed in early developmental issues. So the whole question of how the child is met right at the point of birth, or even before, prenatally, is critical. I'm thinking here also of Winnicott, because he has some fascinating things to say, of course, about the holding environment and meeting the child, as does Martin Buber, the philosopher, with the I-thou relationship. But are you meeting the child with support and relative support and understanding, a validation, a sense of the beauty and amazement of this being coming into life? Or are you meeting them with all kinds of fears and prejudices yourself about the world, polarized mind yourself, where you're absolutely not providing the skills and equipment for that child to come in to the more of who they are and the more of what they've experienced in what Otto Rank calls the trauma of birth. And I do more and more give a lot of credence to his thesis. I do think that is the ground for virtually all future anxiety and trauma. I don't call it the trauma of birth. I think he's a little one-sided in seeing it as all trauma. I call it the drama of birth because I think it has elements of wonder, following on the heels of the initial shock and terror. And I witnessed this with my son. I had the great privilege to be right in front of him as he was born and to cut the cord. And I saw his sense of shock and overwhelm coming out. But then a few seconds later, he's looking around and kind of blowing bubbles. It's very interesting. It seemed to me it was, shock and marveling. So how do we help people come in more into the marveling part where they're a little more centered, a little more settled? I like the dark basement analogy, helping somebody in a dark room, dark basement, to stay with those initially menacing objects. They're poking at you, they're threatening, you don't know what's going to come out of the dark. But if you can hang in there and stay with it, usually with a supportive witness, you can begin to see other possibilities. The thing you thought was going to jab you or maybe kill you looks like something useful, perhaps. Something that might even give you joy that you could play with as your eyes adjust to the light. So this is kind of the overall arc that I experienced in these therapies, moving from terror, incrementally from terror to wonder and some little risk-taking with experiencing my feelings more deeply, with being able to engage with my analyst, taking some risks that I won't die if I do this or that, or if I witness this or that, and the world beginning to open more and more. And just very briefly, the therapy in my graduate years with another deceased therapist, a wonderful existential analyst named Ann Gustin. She was amazing. It was a time where I think a lot of my old traumas and my primal fears were reactivated. It really kind of happened one night with a convergence of very disturbing things like, well, I was far, far away from home, from friends in this strange place in a remote town in Georgia. That's where my graduate school was. Wonderful training in school, humanistic oriented school, but so radically different from the town I was brought up in, Cleveland, the Midwest. Away from my girlfriend at the time, I was about 22. My father came over, he was divorced and just recently married a young lady who was a year older than me. And he was about 45, I think at the time. They were traveling around the country. I think that was a little unsettling for me, but that wasn't the whole thing. It was a cascade. Then we went to a movie. It was called Magic with Anthony Hopkins. It's about a terrifying, mad ventriloquist and his mad dummy. And for some reason, that really got to me in a very deep way. And then we came back to the car. It was a cold winter night. We came back to the car and there was a note on the car saying something to the effect that you will die tonight. This triggered a major panic attack at night. It's like a sieve where all these demons, fears of free fall, being cut from the tether, came through. And I was a wreck, trembling in the morning, very scared, but had the intuition to contact a fellow student who was blind, actually. You think about all the Greek myths about the blind seer. She was wonderful. I just had a feeling she could hold me. And I was beyond my father's realm in that time. She referred me to Anne. She said, "This too shall pass." And I know that's something that can be seen as kind of trite, but it wasn't at all for me. Very hopeful. And then she referred me to Anne, which started close to a year process of demystification about some unfinished business I had about my family and my parents, and mainly learning how to stay present with the most extreme fears and fantasies that were coming up. And I mean extreme, to the points where I was doing things in those fantasies that would otherwise, I think, blow me away, or most of us away. without going into details. But it was so critical that I did that, and I did it on my own, and I processed it with her and did it with her. And in our relationship, when issues came up that were very scary or very hard to contain, I feared I was on the edge there. And I had, anyway, some perceptual issues in my classes as well that I was dealing with. Basically panic. And it's lasted, what was that, 22, 45 years of my life. And helped to give me what I feel is the greatest gift that one could have, perhaps the greatest gift, which is an inner freedom to, to range within the good, the bad, and the ugly. The whole enchilada, I like to say. One's whole body experience in engaging life. And I don't want to sound like this is a panacea or I'm some holier than thou. I still have tremendous respect for the unconscious, what I would call the existential unconscious, which is this terrain of the radically unknown that I do think often shadows our dreams and our terrors of being in a free fall, in a black hole, in scrambling and panicking. That intensity is still there with me. I mean, I respect it. I have a great humility about it. But I also really respect our capacities, my capacity, our capacities, to grow within it, to find ground within groundlessness, as I would put it, because I do think our human condition is groundlessness. I mean, very literally, we experienced the eclipse, and we had some of the sense of the marvel of that. But there is an unsettling element there too. We experienced a quake here recently, first time in 100 years. An unsettling element, also fascinating. I'm from California, I was a little more used to it. But the notion, that we're here needs to be looked at more closely. Yes, we're here, we're having a conversation in a room, though, that is anchored to a ball that is spinning at 67,000 miles per hour, that is nested in a galaxy that's hurtling through the cosmos at 1.2 million miles per hour to a destination that's completely unknown. From an origin that really is completely unknown. We have explanations, but they really don't get at it. So I'm trying to give us a sense of that broader, that bigger picture, and I think deeper picture than we often see in our studies about psychology, psychopathology, and well-being. I don't, let's see, I have until 11, is that right? Or how much time do we have?
Yeah, we go to 11:30. Leave some time for discussion.
Wonderful. Yeah. When would you like me to stop? Absolutely, for the Q&A.
Oh, let's see where we are. Maybe go for 10 more minutes. Is that okay?
10 more minutes. Yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
So as you can see on your screens, the experience of birth, there is a lot of data that is gathering and mounting. We had a Rank symposium recently that Robin actually was at that brought out a lot of this data. But the notion of shifting from relative non-being and unity with the mother and with the cosmos to sudden abrupt being and disunity, I would say even more strongly, sudden abrupt being and chaos, is such a crucible, such a pivotal crucible of our lives. And we have psychophysiological studies indicating that at this Karolinska Institute, very reputable in Sweden, did studies of newborns at the moment of birth. And what the research found was that newborns have higher stress than adults at the point of birth, and higher stress based on stress hormones than severe adult stress. Stress is off the charts at that moment of birth. So this is some indication that a hell of a lot's going on. Of course, we have a lot of studies of attachment theory that indicate this. The still face studies, which I find fascinating. You probably know about Tronick's work. They've done that with babies as young as 2 hours old, not just toddlers, where the mother in the experimental condition goes deadpan with these infants, and how they so quickly, rapidly begin to decompensate and become agitated, looking around, flailing, frustrated, I'd say terrified at a certain point. Interesting studies beginning to crop up that maybe the terror of the unknown, and the radically unknown in particular, is more powerful than the terror of death or death anxiety. This is an ongoing dialogue and inquiry. I think they're very close. And I'm a big fan of Ernest Becker, Denial of Death, where he talks about death as a complex symbol, by the way, not necessarily just the physical state of death, but all that it symbolizes. And terror management theory, brings out death anxiety very explicitly. But a couple of studies in Journal of Experimental Psychopathology did some research with people on what is their biggest fear. And it was terror of the unknown, even beyond death. Very quickly, I'm a fan of, as you know, classic horror books and films, because I think it also takes us to places beyond the ordinary and shows us some possibilities, even though it stretches them too far and become monstrous, but possibilities we otherwise wouldn't know. H.P. Lovecraft, arguably the most critically acclaimed horror writer since Edgar Allan Poe, stated toward the end of his life that the oldest and strongest fear of humankind is the unknown. Oh, it's fear of the unknown. And now I forgot the last line of that. But basically, his point was that the oldest and strongest fear of humankind through all his inquiries was fear of the unknown. And I think you can see this when we talk about our reactions to the radically other in these horror tales and in faces that are deranged or beings that don't fit into our usual schemas. So we've gone over a number of these points, but the critical question is, can we be met in such a way that we can experience another level of anxiety that is not the overwhelming and crippling kind, but is what I call life-enhancing anxiety. Life-enhancing anxiety is the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. Or to put it more concretely, it's the capacity to live on the edge of wonder and discovery, not just terror and overwhelm. And again, Rollo has written beautifully in this in this vein with his book, Meaning of Anxiety. My book is, I think, an homage very much to his book in 1950, which was his dissertation, and draws a lot from Kierkegaard about how this other level of anxiety is a life force. Just quickly, Emma Stone, many of you know about her and her recent role in Poor Things, which I highly recommend. It's a multi-layered film about anxiety and dealing with it. Talked about her own anxiety in an interview recently. And she was horribly panicked and afraid as a kid, and then went through psychotherapy. She said, I feel very lucky to have anxiety. I think it can be sort of like a superpower sometimes. Anxiety is very activating. It gets you out of bed. You can't just stay in one place. It forces you to keep moving. So here, somebody who probably has made a specialty of cultivating life-enhancing anxiety makes a very strong statement. Yes, in my own experience and studies, it is a force to be reckoned with. If you can work with that anxiety, if you can, as I put it, reoccupy the parts of yourself that you've blocked off. And I mean that literally as well as figurative. You're re-embodying, you're re-owning areas that have been blocked off and that are probably very connected with deep wounds around that which is unknown and uncontained, or feels unknown and uncontained. So if we can come into that, we can use it to become more creative, playful, and I also think much more thoughtful and deliberative in terms of our ways of treating people, our ethics, our capacity to be much more centered when we encounter that which is other and different in people, places, and things. And creation knows we've got a problem right now with dealing with otherness, as you all know, with the political and cultural divisiveness, the division between classes, the living in silos and echo chambers that are absolutely the wrong directions, it seems to me, to develop more of this democratic process, if you will, that needs to happen internally. We need to be much better with inner lives than we are with external lives so far, and that's been one of our major problems. Otherwise, we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, in my view. If we're not getting it in the body and able to be connected and feel connected to the degree possible with one's whole body experience within ourselves and in meeting others and the other, or somebody who's associated with radical otherness, I don't think our ways of behaving are going to be very sustainable. Our ethical ways of behaving will be very sustainable. I showed before people who kind of embodied this life-enhancing anxiety, and I don't have time to go into it now. I think I'm going to turn this over to you. These are some questions to look at in terms of your own life and your patients that you see. But I think I referred earlier to a dialogue process I call the experiential democracy dialogue. And this has been my passion in the last several years. I'm a trained moderator for Braver Angels, which is a grassroots group that has 12,000 members now that supports living room style dialogues between self-identified conservatives and liberals. And we did this in each other's homes. We had our own local community in the Bay Area. But I've since then branched off into my own cultivation of that and something I'd cultivated years before, which is a one-on-one mediation approach between people of very different cultural and political backgrounds. And the one-on-one part is very critical here because this approach emphasizes many depth principles of practice that translates them to the social arena. And I will be sending you, if you're interested, a summary, PowerPoint summary of the experiential democracy dialogue. It's a 6-phase model that people can use who have some background in mediation, especially, and who can keep it together to deal with some quite charged issues, and who can adhere to the ground rules, which are absolutely essential in engaging in these type of dialogues. So I think with that, will turn it over to you all, and hopefully, well, I'm excited to have a rich engagement with you all right now.
Thank you, Kirk. I'll just ask you if you could take off your screen share, and that'll help me see everyone. But thank you for a captivating and so engaging presentation. And it's so easy to listen to. Let's see here. We'll get started. 1 second. Okay. First, I always like to check with the in-person audience if we have any questions in person.
Hey, Albert, it's Elizabeth.
Yeah, okay.
I have the mic.
Okay.
First of all, I also wanted to thank Kirk for such a personal and thought-provoking presentation about a form of treatment that we're not so familiar with, and that also connects us to our forebears, Rollo May and Friedrich Reichmann, who are, and Eric Fromm. But the first two are not so often talked about at the Institute, and I think their work bears more exploration by us. My question for you is, I'm going to stay away from the toxic polarization thing, although I would like to see your principles of how to manage those situations clearly. But I think in terms of, we're all clinicians in consulting rooms, and I think it might be interesting if you could say a little bit about the difference between working with anxiety from an interpersonal relational perspective versus an existential one.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Elizabeth. I would say that the difference has to do with the difference in emphasis. There is a growing movement within psychoanalysis that I'm sure you're all aware of around what Robert Stolorow might call the intersubjective encounter that draws much more from an existential or experiential level of contact. And certainly your work with the relational level of contact has a lot of overlap with what we emphasize in existential-humanistic therapy. But I think it's a matter of emphasis. In our trainings at EHI, which is the institute that I'm currently president of, we do a full 6 days of focus basically on cultivating therapeutic presence, because we see that as so vital to the contact, again, the holding environment that Winnicott would talk about. And it goes beyond words. It goes beyond words and explanations and categories. We sometimes do this in silent dyads too, to help our students to really work very intimately with what comes up in silence with each other and then process it. But in the therapeutic arena, I mean, basically, we're acting as passive and active mirrors to the client. For those clients who are ready and desirous of the deeper work, what I call the experiential level of the existential integrative approach. By experiential level, I mean an emphasis on the immediate, the affective, the kinesthetic, and the profound or spiritual, cosmic. And not everybody is capable or desiring of going to that level of exploration. And I really try to respect that. Or they need to take it in steps. That's why I'm integrative, and I do see other modalities as helpful, and I will try to work with the person where they're at, even if that's, basically a physiological level, that helping them get through the night, for example, because of their fragility. But for many people, and many, unfortunately, I think, who are overlooked in our more standardized training in psychology, not you guys per se, the therapist is not even available for that level of contact. So I'm talking about a level of availability at every moment possible for deeper connection. And this is done periodically, and again, as appropriate to the context, by testing the water with the client, like maybe noticing facial change of expression, and wondering. It's through invitations, basically. So I might share, I notice your eyes moistened when you talked about that hurt from your friend. I wonder what that brings up for you. Or I notice your voice got a lot smaller right there. Wonder what happened. Or I feel a tightening in my stomach as you say that. Wonder what comes up for you. And that's an example of active mirroring. I mean, basically, we're there as midwives to clients' self-discovery, but we're experts in helping people to deepen to the extent they're capable, helping people to come into the more of who they are. Again, to reoccupy parts of themselves that have been blocked off. And to a large degree, at that experiential level of contact, through working with the body, the somatic, and at a higher level of intensity, I might even invite someone to engage in what I call an embodied meditation, which is first helping a person to do a grounding meditation, to basically get in touch with their breath, some diaphragmatic breathing, moving inward. And then I invite them to identify any tension areas in their body, any areas that feel blocked or tight, and see if they can stay with one in particular that stands out. And then begin associating to that area. Especially not only the thoughts, but especially what are the feelings, body sensations, and images that come up for you as you make contact with that queasiness in your stomach or that tension in your head. Feelings, body sensations, and images that come up for you. It's a kind of free association, but at a more somatic level. And with some people, I'll even invite them to place their hand on the area that feels affected or feels blocked, injured, and see what comes up. I find these to often enough be very powerful gateways to the deeper wounds and to that immersion process I was talking about before, which is beyond categories and interpretations. I do see a place for those, but I think for many anyway, for fundamental healing to take place, it needs to be at the pre-verbal embodied level. Why? Because you can't wrap a word or a category around it. And in fact, that could be a desecration and a devaluation of that level of reintegration. So it's a long answer, but it depends on desire and capacity for change, and also the therapist's availability to go deep with the clients, because that's going to impact their desire and capacity for change, obviously.
Thank you, Kirk. We'll go to a question online. Sandra Buchler. Sandra.
Thank you very much. First of all, I echo Elizabeth's thanks for such a personal and a very evocative talk. I had two quick questions. One, going back to many years to when I did look at this literature, but I haven't in a long time, I remember the thought that the still face creates anxiety in the infant because it's the absence of the familiar face. It's really creating the anxiety. I wonder if you had thoughts about that. The second thing, of course, as I listened to you, I was contrasting what you're saying with Sullivan, because that's one of the fundamental sources here, and his attitude about anxiety and the idea that anxiety is like a blow in the head and all of that. And I wonder if you have thoughts about who it is that can wrestle with anxiety the way you obviously have, and you help people do. And are there those who fit more into Sullivan's way of thinking about anxiety, or how would you contrast that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is it Sandra? Yeah, thank you. Well, we beginning with Sullivan. Unfortunately, I'm limited in terms of my background, my knowledge of Sullivan's detailed work. I'm certainly familiar with his psychiatric interviewing and the relational as being very important, the interpersonal. And people, you're saying who exhibits or embodies these kinds of qualities? I would say people who basically have worked intensively with their own wounds in their own depth psychotherapy, and especially psychotherapy that does bring the issue to the here and now and the very alive experiential level between client and therapist, within the client. I also listed some of the other folks earlier in the slide. Many of these people had helpful witnesses. So it wasn't necessarily therapists, but for people like Maya Angelou, who was raped at 7 years old, I've heard her talk about this extremely eloquently. She was totally ripped apart by that event. She sought out helpful witnesses in her local library. So sometimes reading inspiring figures can be that witness that you don't have at all in your family system, in your neighborhood. And people like Langston Hughes were extremely inspiring for her in terms of people who had been there in their own way and yet have found ways of transcending, coming into the more of who they are. Rollo found Kierkegaard in the midst of his tuberculosis. And Kierkegaard's emphasis on anxiety being potentially more than crippling and decimating if we can work with it. And it helps us to deal with the paradoxes of life. Yeah, so just some thoughts on that. I don't see how we can get around depth psychotherapy, depth experiential therapy, to cultivate these kinds of skills. And this is why I have a lot of concern about the conventional training in at least American psychology, which puts such an emphasis on the technical aspects, even manualizing cognitive behavioral work, which again, I see having a very important place for certain people at certain times. But it doesn't allow the range of availability that could be so helpful to people like me. And you also talked about the still face. Yeah, absolutely. It's a shift from the familiar. Again, what I was talking about as a kid, a feeling like a rip in the fabric of the familiar and routine. Suddenly ripped open and it's not there anymore. So it's like falling off a cliff. The smile you anticipate, the loving glance, the sort of vibe, the embracing vibe, the enlivening vibe is dashed. Where is a kid without the equipment again? I also realized I didn't get into the whole psychology of awe, which I do believe comes out of a cultivation of life-enhancing anxiety. But I think the cultivation of a sense of awe is perhaps one of the heights of the culmination of this existential therapeutic process. Because once one is freed up to overcome, and it's often through many revisitations with what is trying to break through in the patient and how they stop themselves, and the therapist calling attention to both so that they can see closer and closer up their battle and feel it more and more in their body to the point where hopefully a kind of counter will, as Ron puts it, or frustration comes up. They're not going to take it anymore, and they are going to live with the therapist, to be more alive and in their lives. They're more freed up to follow that creative project, that love, that relationship, or that intimacy that was blocked off before, or whatever it is. But beyond specifics and specific goals, let's say, in some people, it helps to create a whole new attitude toward living, moment to moment, the degree possible. And this is where I think it gets into the spiritual realm that I would call a sense of awe. Because you are opened up to your deepest dreads and your most dazzling desires. In a sense of awe, I define as the humility and wonder or sense of adventure toward living. You're able to connect with your vulnerability, with very vulnerable places. And at the same time, and just as emphatically, your capacity to venture out and be bold and to wonder and to feel like you're participating in something much greater than yourself, to take that leap into deeper and further connections. So I find that to be one of the most wonderful transcendental terms because it encompasses the paradoxes and thus vital heartthrob of so many of our lives.
Thank you.
Go on,
No, so your answers are like highways into depth as well. Thank you. But we'll get a few more in. I'll check in person. Do we have any questions? Okay.
Hi, Albert. Yeah, this is Kendra. I'm a fifth-year doctoral student at Adelphi here at White on internship. And I just think it's so interesting that, right, as you suggested, in some ways you've already answered this question, but to be confronted at such a young age, 6, was it that this question of death and just having no idea sort of how to cope with it. A good friend of mine was just telling me about how I forget how old he is, but his nephew sort of starting to wonder about this, and he has a background in religion, but he's like, I have no idea how to describe this concept of death, sort of, and think of sort of Irvin Yalom's death, meaningless, isolation, freedom, as these sort of big questions. So if a lot of the things that we're dealing with in treatment or our patients are dealing with are these sort of like big unsolvable questions, I guess sort of how do you work with that? What's the right? I mean, we don't have the answers, and maybe at White, sort of an interpersonal approach is to think about how we exists sort of in relation to these questions. And in that way, it's in a state of anxiety. But just with these sort of like big, from an existential perspective, having these big unsolvable questions cause sort of pathologies. Yeah, how do you work with that? How do you address those questions?
Well, I tried to elaborate some of that just earlier in terms of helping people work at the experiential level of contact. You know, there's no golden key or magic about it. And I think that ultimately a lot of the process of working with and working through many of these wounds is a capacity to coexist with the mysterious and the unknown, and just simply acknowledge humbly that it is there and it is daunting. And yet one doesn't have to live one's life completely and trapped or entangled in it, but can accept maybe a kind of Eastern sensibility in a way, can accept a coexistence with that which is far beyond us. But boy, you can develop a capacity to experience a much greater range than most of us conceive, especially if we go through these kinds of intensive therapeutic processes, relational processes. And tragically, if you've been shaken in some way. This is one of the strange paradoxes of our field, I think, that one often needs to be shaken in some way. Hopefully it doesn't have to be the kind of trauma that I experienced or others experience, even obviously much worse horrors. But I do think that if things are just hunky-dory all the way along, and that's the world you're presented in something like a Pleasantville, I'm thinking of movies, you'll be skimming surfaces for a lot of your life. And you won't know that tremendous gratification or the more enduring gratification of a deeper love for life, for others, for the gift of this.
Thank you, Kirk. We'll take another question. One thing that is the work dovetails very nicely with recent trauma theory and work with trauma as far as the groundedness and having had to go through something to grow. We'll go with Ed Silver online.
Hi, Dr. Schneider, thank you very much. A really stimulating presentation, topic I've been fascinated with for a long time. Sorry, I have a little frog in my throat. In 1948, Herbert Marcuse writes a review of Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. And he critiques Sartre's concept of being for itself. And he makes this really interesting, 1948, so he makes this really interesting observation that the human condition, as it exists for a French worker under Nazi occupation, doesn't look like the human condition for what he calls the shop clerk in New York City, right? And he's pointing here to the fact that, like, we can't just sort of assume that we choose our mode of existence, that we all have sort of the same kind of basic freedom, right? In the way that Kierkegaard talked about anxiety as a signal of the fact that we're sort of radically free. And so what I'm wondering is, how does, in a practical way, right, how does existential analysis deal with those concrete relationships of power that structure our identity, that tell us who we are in ways that are really quite durable? So people who have to deal with, for example, racial marginalization, people who have to deal with, sort of social class divisions, et cetera. In practical terms, what does that look like in the consulting room for the existential analyst?
No, that's a great question. And actually, Marcuse is not the only one who critiqued Sartre on this radical notion of freedom. I have issues with it. I know Rollo also did. Merleau-Ponty talks about it, that, we don't start in a vacuum. We don't choose in a vacuum. there's already a great deal of meaning and sedimented meaning that we're choosing from. So I think it's absolutely relevant. At the same time, we do have some very interesting models who perhaps set the bar for finding a capacity to choose one's attitudes towards situations. I'm thinking of Viktor Frankl as maybe a much more known example of how he was able to use his internal freedom of choice to picture his wife smiling on a beautiful sunny day in the midst of the detritus and the degradation of a Nazi death camp. Stephen Hawking, how the hell did he maintain a connection with the cosmic and the beauty of the cosmic in his work while he's suffering ALS? So these are extraordinary people and examples, but my point is they set the bar, can be done, and that's a great thing. In terms of my work, and by the way, you can see this work, Existential Integrative Therapy, summarized in the book, Existential Integrative Therapy, Guidepost to the Core of Practice. So it more methodically takes you through it. There's some videos on it as well. But this is why I'm integrative, because I don't think people, a number of people are ready, willing, or even culturally oriented toward an exploratory approach right off the bat. There needs to be a lot of priming of the ground and maybe complete, avoidance of a deeper, more exploratory approach with certain people. That said, I do think cultivating presence and an ability to be deeply present as a therapist is ongoingly critical. I mean, people like Frantz Fanon, for example, alluded to this in his work. When he worked with psychiatric patients, he was trying to bring a more humane connection with his patients. I mean, he was sort of doing R.D. Laing, but with a much more multicultural community in bringing a humanity to his patients, whatever they were working on. I mean, more technically, he could see the more of who they are beyond their labels. And often those labels were informed by the prejudices, the bigotry, the colonization of the time. So I think we can learn a lot from him in terms of applying that present availability, that humanity ongoingly in whatever mode we're working with the client. And certainly, yeah, I think there's a place for demystification, for psychoeducation, and for the therapist learning and growing and keeping a place of humility along with patients from diverse backgrounds. And sometimes, as I say, in the context of a good dialogue, maybe helping somebody get through the night with medicine is where they need to go and where they choose to go initially, using some very basic breathing exercises or meditations to help ground them to find a foothold in their situation is important. Or maybe something more immediate, like, the more somebody is in the zone of immediate danger, the more activist I am, like recommending that they get the hell out of their house and go to that safe house, temporarily. I'm really scared for you. Again, not coming across, hopefully not autocratically, still with an invitational quality, but firmly and sharing my honest feeling with the patient. So yeah, I do think that we should learn as much as we can about the multicultural colonizing mentality and decolonizing, and also recognize this is an individual, unique human being too. That's phenomenology.
Thank you.
The
Thank you,
most
Kirk.
intimate understanding of the individual and context. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Ed. Just gonna give another chance for some more questions or comments. We'll check with the in-person audience.
Yeah. Hi, Albert. This is Brendan Prevaden. I'm also a fifth-year student at Delphi doing my internship. My question's a little different. I couldn't help but think as you were talking, right, that like in some way the anxiety that you're speaking to is a bit of a life force. It's a means of kind of bringing us in touch with, you know, going in but also going out. And the thing that occurred to me as you were speaking about some of this is how much, partially from my own experience, but also just too from the larger world, how there's so much like anti-anxiety medication at this point in our lives, right? And noticing for me, my own experience with that, how at once it sort of tamped down an anxiety that felt unhelpful, but at some point it also began to tamp down what felt sort of like a core sense of emotional self. And so all that to say, I wonder if in your practice in the last, 35 years since Prozac has been around, right? Like if you've noticed a change, certainly in people's anxiety, but also in their connection to that sort of life-giving force and their search for meaning. Like, are they less inclined to do that because of our medications?
Very good question. I would say it's a mixture. Some people are tamped down and somewhat blocked off from that vital life force of anxiety because of the medication. And some are more enabled to go there, to deepen the work by having the edge taken off. So it really just depends. But I do think overall that we're in a lot of trouble with our quick fix, instant result, social framework that so many of us live within, because we're not learning the skills that are so necessary to a more vital life, and not only within, but among each other, in my view. So I'm very circumspect about medicine. Don't totally rule it out by any means, because I think it can be helpful, and I've seen it be helpful to patients. And I've worked at the state hospital as well as private practice areas. But I think we need to be very discerning and have good discussions about the implications of taking the medication. And while they're taking it as well, how it's affecting them. Yeah, being careful about not feeding into the very problem that often brought people to us, which is, looking for some quick fix or some absolute position, even if that position is miserable, versus learning to work with, again, and make the best of that which is now ripped open in one's life.
Thank you, Kirk. We'll go to a question online. I'm Howard.
Thank you, Albert, and thank you, Kirk, for your sharing of your personal story. I just want to draw a distinction between different forms of anxiety, because I think that's also relevant to the lifespan and multicultural perspective, because even across an individual lifespan, different anxieties will manifest at different times. And terror management theory, for example, in the research with it, as you know, they show mortality salient images, graveyard, for example, and then anxiety about one's own personal death is acknowledged or peaked. Mario Mikulincer, though, has some interesting data that moderates that. And that is from the social psychology perspective that measures anxiety and avoidance in close romantic relationships. And that data showed that when people are low on anxiety, low on avoidance, in other words, have mutually supportive romantic relationships, you don't get the mortality salience reaction. Then the separation anxiety is the issue. And if you think about the pandemic, I don't think many people weren't particularly worried about their personal death or the risk of personal death. Many were, and many should be. But more often, people were worried about the aloneness of a loved one, concern, anxiety about the death of the other, separation, loss of love, and so on. I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. Really important points. I mean, I'm a big fan of the TMT folks and the research that they've done and correlations they've made. But I also agree with you that these are ongoing inquiries, and these are ongoing puzzlements about what are the deeper or deepest terrors that we have and that drive us to extremes. And I could well see that separation anxiety might be the issue for some, a sense of isolation, loss could be major. Thinking about what people say about their own dying, it is often the sense of being alone, being cut off from very close relations. And just the whole fantasy of what that brings. It seems to me that a part of that relates to this free fall that I was talking about before, being cut from the mothership, so to speak, of those who are close, that which is familiar, and being lost with total unknowing of where one is drifting and heading, and just how to fathom that. It seems to me, I'm back to Becker, that death is a complex symbol, and it certainly can represent the radically other and unknown and uncontained. And I think we need to look at that more.
Thank you, Kirk.
Yeah.
No, sorry, they were just watching the time. We have about 1 minute left. I'll check in. Is there a comment in person audience? And if not, Kirk, to thank you again for such an intimate and engaging, well, educational experience. Thank you so much. And if you have any closing words, this is our last minute.
Well, much appreciation to you all for taking this journey with me. And I hope it's sparked some further inquiry for you with your whole body, your whole body experience. And I hope in some ways that our paths cross again. I'd like
Thank you, Kirk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Some virtual applause. Thank you.